Another world, another time, in the age of wonder. Another world, another time. His land was green and good.
Hello everyone, this is likely to be part of a series in a bunch of responses to a kind of critique of a pamphlet I wrote called Diversity Dungeons. And this criticism, this rebuke of what I've written there is by Asa Ruse, whose name I'm probably mispronouncing. Someone I've actually met and played with at an old IndieCon. So she should know better, really. What's amazing to me in this instance is that her criticisms are very much a case of death of the author. They are making a whole bunch of presumptions and presenting a very pseudo-academic argument, presuming things about what I mean and what I say. And what's particularly disturbing about that is that I spend a reasonable amount of time in the introduction to the book explaining explicitly what I mean and what the purpose of the book is. And this has rather uncharitably apparently been ignored in the content of this article that she's written, which is just part one of apparently a series of articles. So it's rather strange to me that you would basically completely ignore what someone says about their reasons and motivations for writing and would instead ascribe meanings and motivations to them that they haven't said that are their motivations. It's very weird and honestly quite disrespectful. So anyway, I'm going to respond to the response in this video, and I will do that for other sections of her work as it comes up. She does mention Gamergate. I'm not going to spend too much time on that because obviously, hopefully, I'm writing a book on the whole bloody thing. So I don't want to spend too much time on that. I want to concentrate more on the book itself. So let's get started.
When I'm quoting from the article, it will look and sound like this.
And when I'm responding from the original text and myself, it will look like this.
Reading heteronormativity into imaginary worlds. Cards on the table. I am and will probably always be a feminist. I'm one of those pesky people criticising the gaming industry and culture because it lacks an inclusive and diverse point of view. In short, I'm most likely one of the people Desborough talks about in the introduction to Diversity Dungeons.
I don't actually talk about anyone in the introduction. I talk more about the environment and the situation. Tell you what, I'll read the whole introduction after these opening passages and you can judge for yourself. I do find it amusing, though, that many of these people supposedly arguing for diversity are actually proposing a rather homogeneous and unified and singular way of approaching all of these creative issues. There's no diversity of ideas, and that's the diversity that actually matters.
In part, this text is a rebuttal of Diversity Dungeons, but it is also a queer and skewed reading of the same. By putting rule mechanics to the privileges and drawbacks of ethnicity, gender, sexuality, and ability, Desborough shines a light not only on power structures, but on the preconceptions and stereotypes within large parts of the gaming culture. Desborough takes the outside view of marginalised groups in the industry and culture, the same kind of outside view that the privileged tend to take when explaining to marginalised groups what the problem really is.
This passage is almost a kind of encapsulation of many of the problems that I have with social justice warrior culture, for want of another word. The embracing of subjectivity, the rejection of objectivity, the hypocrisy in claiming to be anti-prejudice and anti-bigotry, while at the same time using prejudice and bigotry to dismiss the point of view of an outsider on issues, even though they may be very well educated on the subject or have an important or integral observation to make that can only be gained with the distance of objectivity. and the whole presumption of the motivation and so on of the person that they're criticizing. As to the content and mechanics, they're not to so much comment on particular things or to present a particular stereotype. If anything, the stereotypes and drawbacks and so on are drawn from social justice ideas, not from myself so much. So that's kind of a shot in the foot there, I'm afraid. And that I'm attempting to represent the inequalities in a way that people might be able to grasp and use as a kind of language of games. What I mean is that the representations and stereotypes, the penalties and problems are much more drawn from social justice claims than anything else. So if there's a place that these stereotypes are being drawn from, it's history and the claims of social justice activists. She next quotes a passage from the book, but I'll read that now in my own voice and then move to what she says afterwards. So here's the part that she takes out of the introduction. This booklet intends to examine these issues in and of themselves, outside of the current state of controversy, and to ask, rather, how we might better simulate the plight of minority groups, understand them within the context of fictional worlds, make allowances for player characters who might seek to buck those societal trends, or allow characters, through their actions, to affect social change within the game worlds.
The choice of words, simulating the plight of minority groups and understanding them, is telling. The way the text is written is more or less othering, all by itself.
I'm not really sure how you could come to that conclusion, especially since you just quoted the full context, in which it becomes obvious that I'm speaking, well, any way you want to look at it, really. As the writer, I am speaking of someone other than myself. Though I do fit within certain minority groups, I'm also including myself. In the context of an instructional manual, which is kind of what it is, you're telling people what your intention is. It's very hard to see how you could read that othering into it. You're just talking about a group. You could say simulating the existence of white male cisgender whatever you could, and it would be exactly the same language, and yet you wouldn't necessarily say that it was othering then. So I think this is a case of subjectivity running wild and a lack of distance.
There are no sources anywhere in Desborough's booklet. Instead, there is a sense of everybody knows permeating the text. Part of what is taking time is finding sources and reading books on these issues. I want to present an alternative point of view, a perspective, if you will, and I want to provide sources supporting that alternative point of view.
I wasn't presenting an academic paper. I was presenting a guide booklet for games masters and game designers. As such, using sources didn't seem particularly relevant, and there is nothing that I put forward in the booklet that is in any way particularly controversial, except in some very, very closed circles. So it's hard to see the necessity. But using sources and so on in the reply is going to lend a certain sense of pseudo-authority and pseudo-academia to that response. I intend to do my responses to the response in video format, which makes citations and so on difficult, but I will attempt where possible to reference sources.
I'll not be able to present research that is specifically focused on tabletop role-playing games because frankly there isn't much out there. I'll however use research made on literature and digital games as well as design and game design. Before digging into the text though, I have to ask this. If we are creating worlds that are entirely made up, why isn't it possible to step out of stereotypes? In some cases, old school Renaissance in particular, the absurd and slightly twisted is a common occurrence. In the book Vornheim, snakes are bred and kept because they are books and can be read using the right tools. The more uncommon the snake, the rarer the book. If these things are possible in an imaginary world, how come diversity, equality, and or a complete reversal of power, like that of Egalia's daughters, is not, except as a malfunctioning, inherently evil matriarchy in the form of the drow?
It is true that there isn't a great deal of research that has been done into tabletop games. Personally, I think that might be a blessing, because when looking at the quality of research done in the literary sphere or in the sphere of computer games, particularly by Digra, one finds that it is just not of quality. It is incredibly skewed, it is not subject to decent or proper peer review. It's basically just, this is my opinion and my mates agree with me. So by and large, I'm afraid I have to consider that entire sphere of research to be almost entirely trash. So there are also problems when you look at literary criticism, standpoint theory, critical theory, when it comes to literature and games. So a lot of the research that she's going to be research in heavy inverted commas that she is going to end up referencing, I have no time for at all. I think it's entirely subjective, massively based on erroneous assumptions. Where possible, I'll try to address that, but it's a problem. Much of this sphere is just inherently flawed. As regards why things can't be strange or different, plenty of things are strange or different. The Drow are far from the only matriarchal society to be found in fiction or games. The Aslan in Traveller spring to mind immediately as a matriarchy. The women there hold all the political and economic power. There are plenty of other examples. The Drow aren't the only one. I think people who think that need to read more broadly and consider more deeply why things are as they are. But equally, one can find offensive stereotypes the other way, with certain games about witches who go around turning horrible cis-het white male oppressors into animals and feeding them to their cats and so on. There's plenty of rather gratuitous and horrible stereotypes going in all directions, and you know what? That's fine. It's none of my business. I can just say I don't like this game, I think it's stupid, I can even explicate on the reasons for it, but that doesn't mean it's evil and shouldn't exist, which seems to be the thrust of the, again, heavy quotes, criticism coming from this kind of perspective. There's a paradox in fantastical fiction, in that in many ways the more fantastical elements you introduce, the more you need to emphasize the normalcy of a lot of the other things that you're talking about. So your fantasy world might include magic and dragons, but if the characters aren't relatable, then you have a problem. And this is why people often resort to at least surface stereotypes in a lot of ways, or familiar relationships. It's why a lot of fantasy novels have a recognizable monarchical system to them. It's because that is something that people understand and immediately grasp the context of, and then the magic and so on happens on top of that, but that remains graspable. Even incredibly freaky and strange and wildly different books, such as China Miéville's Baslag series, for all their weirdness and strangeness, are still understandable. The lead character in the first book in the Baslag series has basically an aunt for a girlfriend. Weird, but it's relatable because she's facing prejudice. They're defying people, they're going against society and so on, and that's something we can understand. Similarly, if you look to the X-Men, for example, it might not directly address racial issues, but it is an analogy and a metaphor for the civil rights struggle. So even though we're talking about people with mutant powers and lasers firing out of their eyes and so on, you can identify with their struggle because it contains familiar elements. That's basically at the heart of why, even when we do incredibly weird and freaky things in our worlds, there still has to be something relatable, which you can negatively choose to call stereotypes. But these are things that make these games and worlds and characters and so on relatable, let people understand them, put themselves in their shoes, and it's what drives a lot of fiction and makes it work. There are exceptions.
The right to go unquestioned. Enough of that for the time being. It's time to start reading Diversity Dungeons. It starts off pretty interestingly. I followed Desborough for quite some time on Twitter until early 2015, when he became more focused on Gamergate. He was at that point a strong advocate for Gamergate, a movement with effects on the gaming community that I found despicable. According to Desborough, Gamergate is all about ethics in gaming journalism. This is how he views the phenomenon.
Well, I'll speak for myself on that score, if you don't mind. An indie computer game developer who happened to be a woman, irrelevant, was exposed as having cheated on her boyfriend, irrelevant, with people who happen to hold positions in gaming media and to have given her all sorts of booster articles and kudos. Supremely fucking relevant.
In other words, Desborough doesn't subscribe to the commonly held belief that Gamergate is primarily a harassment campaign aimed at women in the industry. He also believes that the connection between Quinn and Grayson is relevant. This despite that there is no proof that any such boosting of Quinn's game exists.
Like I said, I really don't want to spend too much time on this because hopefully I'll be writing a whole book about it, but this is nonsense. It was never an harassment campaign, and Quinn in particular is not actually especially relevant to Gamergate, save as the spark that set it all off, so I don't particularly want to get into that. As regards the relevance of her relationship with Grayson, well, you say there's no evidence. And yet, if we take a quick little stroll over to Deep Freeze... Excuse the clicking and pauses, but I want to make sure that I have this absolutely right. If we go to deepfreeze.it, which is a great resource for finding out all of the corruption and nepotism going on in gaming journalism, and we click on journalists, and we click on Nathan Grayson, we get his profile. He has 17 things that he has done wrong. He's linked with Kotaku and previously Rock Paper Shotgun. If we scroll down, starting at the top, we see in the second paragraph that he is noted for having positive coverage of Zoe Quinn in 3 articles without disclosing their friendship and eventual affair. He later covered Quinn again, disclosing that they dated briefly, but not that he had previously financially supported her. So these articles include Green for Greenlight, September 5th, 2012. Admission Quest, Valve greenlights 50 more games. That's from January 8th, 2014. TMI on Kinja, the indie game reality TV show that went to hell, where he writes about her. That's the game jam that she sabotaged. And then there's a link to a pastebin of demonstrations of various links between them. So, yeah, if you go to Deep Freeze, you can get everything you need to see there. Like I said, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it's just nonsense to A, claim it was about harassment. I mean, that was debunked plenty of times. Or that it was particularly to do with Zoe Quinn. Or that there is no problem in her links with, just as one example, Nathan Grayson. It's all there, it's all documented, you can see it for yourself. Skipping over the Gamergate specific stuff, she then quotes me again, so I'll read that again in my own voice. From the introduction in Diversity Dungeons. The position I hold being that free expression and the vision of the author or creator should trump any and all concerns, including diversity, representation, and so on. To my mind, the answer is for people to create according to their own conscience, not to be condemned out of hand or for their motivations to be presumed, and for diversity of ideas to be the benchmark. I want a world in which Varg Vikernes and David Hill can both make and sell games, and I can ignore both of them.
There is something flawed in the reasoning here, and it's something I think comes from the gaming culture in general. One is that creators who are respectful of diversity and equality aren't doing it because they want to, but because they are forced to, which is a strange assumption to make. When I read stories like that of Guerrilla Games' Horizon Zero Dawn and how they had to convince Sony that a female lead was the way to go, I don't see the developers being forced into an SJW agenda. I see publishers like Sony being worried and potentially shutting down the creative freedom of the developers. Another is that an author of games should not be held accountable for the work they create. I think that's where most of the disconnect occurs. If you are a creator, someone who does things, your work will be questioned by people. It's simply put, unavoidable. You can either go with it and learn from it, or you can write long essays on why it's unfair. I'm not sure that this is what Desborough actually means by what he's saying, but I have a hard time interpreting it any other way.
there's an assumption in that the heavy inverted commas criticism is justified, or that there is anything necessarily to learn from whatever criticism you get. There's another option, which is to refute that heavy quotes criticism and to counteract it. Now, part of the big problem we have, and one I think I actually addressed in the book, is that what people are calling criticism often isn't. Rather than saying, I don't like this and here's why, it's I don't like this, therefore it's evil, therefore it shouldn't exist. So what people are calling criticism often isn't. And also, as in the problem in this response, is that there is often a case of people making assumptions and presumptions about the thoughts of the person doing the writing, even when, as in this case, they explicitly state why they're doing, what it's intended for, and so on. Someone else comes along and puts their own spin on it. So there's issues there. It's also not an either-or prospect that either commercial pressure or social justice warrior pressure is bad. To use a well-worn meme, why not both? I am against both. Lots of companies do feel pressured into ticking the diversity boxes and going along with various agendas, because otherwise they receive a disproportionate amount of online hate. Even companies that have tried very hard to pander to this activated Twitterati demographic of torch-wielding mobbery still suffer under it. Joss Whedon, for all he says, was chased off Twitter by one of these social justice mobs. Marvel has attempted to pander to them, but it's just meant they've been put under even more and more scrutiny over time, and it's tanked their sales to a large extent, something admitted by their own higher-ups. So to pretend that there isn't this pressure, this problem for people's creativity, these exercises in box ticking and so on, is just to be blind to what's going on. Yes, commercial pressures are also a problem, but at least they're somewhat rational in that the company wants to make back its money, and with huge amounts of budgets involved, they want to take as few risks as possible. That is stifling to creativity, that's a problem, but it's an angle that is much more understandable, I think, in a lot of ways. Demanding people include you and kicking up a fuss if they don't is also bad. If you can understand why commercial pressure is bad for creativity and you can rail against that, where is the disconnect that you can't see that other similar forms of pressure upon people are also bad in the same way? At least my position is consistent. I think both of these issues are problems, and the creator should be free to make whatever they want in both instances. That's a solid principle that's being applied universally. Where's yours? The rest of this section largely belabors the same point, and I think I've basically responded to it already, so I'm going to move on.
Why do we feel the need to reproduce old patterns? This should come as no surprise. In games we are reproducing old patterns where women are subjugated and men are powerful. The most obvious proof I've gotten with regards to this was a forum post on a Swedish forum. The post has since been deleted and is not archived. The poster apologised, which is why I won't be stating the source. In this post, an angry writer attacked me for pointing out that the NPCs, both men and women, were very stereotypical. This is the response, my translation from Swedish. In the future, please spare us your rabid attacks on men and masculinity. Spare us from your personal opinions in the debate about genders, and keep your crazy feminist thoughts about sexism to yourself. I'm as much for equality as anyone else, but isn't it enough that we keep it to the real world? Can't we, men, even fantasize about a world that is unfair, a world where men are worth more than women, a world where humans are worth more than orcs, a world where a lot is black and white, a world where brutal violence is used instead of words? I'm using this quote because it encapsulates so well how I personally experience many RPGs. They are unfair worlds, racist worlds, black and white worlds where violence is the most common conflict resolution. Michelle Nephew, in her article from Gaming as Culture, says that the misogyny present in many RPGs use women to enhance or titillate the men, were treated as a backdrop, used when needed. She goes on to say, the dominance of the male adventurers is constantly foregrounded through the game's thinly disguised gender inequality and focus on combat and violence. the hallmarks of male fantasy, and an outlet for the male player's erotic desires is provided by the misogyny common to role-playing.
Much like the earlier section that encapsulated many of the issues I find with social justice warrior criticism, this section does the same, particularly the quoted sections. There is a presumption of misogyny, and there is a hypocritical presumption that non-violent approaches to conflict are more feminine, whereas violent approaches to conflict are more masculine. This from people who are constantly trying to say that these things aren't gendered. That seems to conveniently disappear when they need it to. So, the other big problem I have here is that there is always this seeming inability to separate reality from fantasy on the part of these, heavy quotes, critics. This is a problem we've seen down the years in many instances of these moral panics. It seems that while the people that happily consume the media are able to tell the difference between reality and fantasy, those who criticize it, who up until recently have largely been outsiders, seem to be the ones who haven't been able to tell the difference. This is how you get people bemoaning D&D for supposedly teaching people to become satanic magicians and so on. It's because they can't tell that it's fantasy, whereas the players can. They take it seriously, whereas the players don't. When you consume sexist media, it doesn't mean that you're sexist. It doesn't mean that the creator of the media is sexist either. Misogyny here is a term being misused, and this is another issue that I tend to have with social justice warriors, their willful, newspeak-esque way of redefining and misusing terms. Misogyny is hatred and prejudice towards women for being women. It doesn't say anything inherently about sexy representations, and there's no reason to think that sexy equals sexist. Fantasy is fantasy. Reality is reality. People enjoy things in their fantasies that would horrify them in reality. According to some studies, something like 60% of women have rape fantasies. Does anyone in their right mind actually think that means women want to be raped? Of course not. Ludicrous. But that's still a common fantasy that many people indulge in and enjoy through their media. It says absolutely nothing about the creator of that media, the consumer of that media, the people involved in the production of that media. Nothing whatsoever. Everything that you put onto this is projection, seemingly of your own insecurities and lack of understanding of your own mind. Other people are strong and capable enough of consuming media without it dominating and mind controlling them. There's a whole lot of waffle next, much of it referencing the very kinds of papers that I've talked about that I basically don't recognise as being actually academic or worth anything, to be honest. There's not a lot to reply to for a whole chunk there. There will be a link to the article below, so you can follow that to your heart's content and read the bits that I've missed out. But the problem is that I basically do not agree at all with the underlying presumptions upon which everything is spun. And when you build your castle in a swamp, it sinks. So if I don't agree at all with the underlying presumption, then everything that's spun off it, I don't agree with at all either. So there's basically nothing to address for a whole chunk of that because I don't go along with that underlying presumption. So let's skip forward pretty much to the end.
When Desborough states Diversity Dungeons is his attempt to simulate and understand the plight of minority groups within the context of fictional worlds, I interpret the text less as an investigation and more as a way to, through game mechanics and rules, reinforce the present status quo. None of the suggestions by Desborough step outside of heteronormativity. All the suggestions made are firmly based in current norms surrounding gender, ethnicity, sexuality, and function. Diversity Dungeons is a booklet rooted in a fairly conservative state of being. Any deviation is held up as other. That way the book may seem to be an investigation into prejudice and preconceptions, but what it really does is reinforce them.
Again, I must point out that I literally say exactly what the booklet is for and what it's about, and yet disrespectfully again, she seems to try to read into what I'm doing something entirely different. It's not about overturning anything, it's about how to use these elements. I don't just draw on modern interpretations of these things, but historical contexts and narratives. It's about bringing these kinds of elements into your games, how to represent them, how to think about them, how to world build around them. Of course it's not going to... I don't even know what you expect it to do, to be honest. It's just meant to represent and replicate prejudice and other issues, to perhaps explain why they exist, how they might fit into an historical narrative, how you can, or a fictional narrative, how you can step outside and around them, how people have stepped outside and around them historically. Like I say, I say what it's for, so I don't know where the fuck you're getting this from. It's just absurd and, like I say, disrespectful. You know, I don't leave room, really, for you to put your own spin and interpretation on it. I tell you exactly and explicitly what the booklet is about and what it's for. So what I'm going to do now for people is I'm going to read the full introduction to it to you, where I explain what it's about, what it's for, the context, and everything. Okay, so here is the full introduction to Diversity Dungeons. Much digital ink and blood has been spilt talking about diversity representation in tabletop gaming, and in every other field of geek and nerd endeavour. Usually these conversations are extremely combative, and they tend to end poorly for everyone involved. I've been involved in these debates and discussions myself, to my detriment. The position I hold being that free expression and the vision of the author or creator should trump any and all other concerns, including diversity, representation, and so on. To my mind, the answer is for people to create according to their own conscience, not to be condemned out of hand for their motivations to be presumed, and for diversity of ideas to be the benchmark. I want a world in which Varg Vikernes and David Hill can both make and sell games, and I can ignore both of them. That said, I cannot help but be drawn to controversial topics. That is where the interesting conflicts and stories lie, and there are few topics so controversial as the treatment of minorities within media. Here we arrive at a nexus point between realism, expectation, demands for representation, demands for free expression, historical revisionism, magic, science fiction, truth, is and ought. That makes it interesting, but the battle lines of identarian politics, liberalism, conservatism, the regressive left and cultural libertarianism also make it an area fraught with difficulty and willful misunderstanding. There are no good, or at least no satisfactory, answers to a lot of these questions. Perhaps there are just multiple approaches, each of which will annoy some group or the other. What's true in all circumstances, however, is that these controversial topics are interesting, fascinating, and important in terms of world, character, and scenario building, whatever your particular stance. This booklet intends to examine these issues in and of themselves, outside of the current state of controversy, and to ask, rather, how we might better simulate the plight of minority groups, understand them within the context of fictional worlds, make allowances for player characters who might seek to buck those societal trends, or allow characters, through their actions, to affect social change within the game worlds. For sake of ease, we shall be using the OGL and Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition as a framework for the discussion and for examples that require the use of statistics. So given that she has ignored what I say it's for, what the intention of it is, I'm going to repeat that last section again. This booklet intends to examine these issues in and of themselves, outside of the current state of controversy, and to ask, rather, how we might better simulate the plight of minority groups, understand them within the context of fictional worlds, make allowances for player characters who might seek to buck those societal trends, or allow characters, through their actions, to affect social change within the game worlds. I don't know how I can be more clear on that. Zang.
When I was just a baby,